This is Uprising. I'm Sonali. A major climate conference in Copenhagen opens today, bringing together delegates from more than 100 countries with climate scientists. This ahead of a United Nations summit in Paris next year. They're tasked with editing a major report, a draft of which was leaked to the press, and apparently states that climate change could have, quote, serious, pervasive, and irreversible impacts on human civilization. The news comes just days after the European Union agreed late last week to cut its emissions by 40% from 1990 levels by the year 2030. Despite the strength of such an action, it may still not come soon enough or be drastic enough. A new study published in Nature Geoscience yesterday confirms what countless others have shown, that climate change will be utterly devastating. Specifically, based on the results of a computer simulation, the study predicts that communities in Europe and Asia will be twice as likely to have colder and harsher winters than they do now. 97% of active climate scientists know that our planet is warming and that we caused it through our over-reliance on fossil fuels. What scientists also know is that unless we take radical steps now to curb our emissions, we are hurtling toward a dystopian future. Author Naomi Klein wants to shape that future in a way that gives us the best shot at surviving in a warming climate and finding justice and equity along the way. She lays out her plan in a new book called This Changes Everything: Capitalism versus the Climate. If the vast influence of her earlier book, The Shock Doctrine, is any indication, then the book by Naomi Klein does indeed change everything. It puts the onus of climate change squarely on the shoulders of our global capitalist system and makes the most compelling case to date for why the issue of climate change is to be squarely on the shoulders of capitalism. Naomi Klein is an award-winning journalist and author of the critically acclaimed #1 international bestseller, The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, and No Logo, Taking Aim at the Brand Bullies. She's a contributing author and editor for Harper's Magazine, a reporter for Rolling Stone, and a syndicated columnist for The Nation and The Guardian. She's also a member of the board of directors of 350.org and a Puffin Foundation writing fellow at the Nation Institute. I spoke with Naomi Klein recently about her book. Welcome to Uprising, Naomi Klein.
Thank you.
Now, before we get into the sort of dire need to address climate change, which we'll just take for granted, let's discuss the fact that even today, when study after study is proving, beyond reasonable doubt how serious the issue is, even when 97% of active climate scientists agree that we're in trouble, there's still a very vocal, very well-funded sector of society that denies the planet is warming. And we've kind of come to accept that that's how it's going to be. But there is a reason for their denial that's actually based on something pretty fundamental that you touch on in your book, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I spend a little time in the book looking at the climate change denier movement. It's just one chapter. And that movement is a product of the right-wing think tank complex. It's really important to understand that this is not like a wing of the scientific community that broke off organically to say, no, the science is wrong. It's a creation of the think tank complex. And, the vast majority of the books are published by think tanks like the American Enterprise Institute, the Cato Institute, the Heartland Institute, which is, of course, the ground zero of climate change denial. And this is not a scientific organization. This is a free market think tank, or so-called free market think tank. And the reason they deny climate change is because these are policy organizations. These are lobby groups, whatever you want to call them. The think tanks exist to push a very particular worldview that we're all familiar with. It's privatization, deregulation, cuts to social spending, free trade, just the panoply of neoliberal policies. And what they understand, it's the argument I make, is that if climate change is real, if those 97% of climate scientists are telling the truth, then essentially their whole ideological project collapses. Because obviously greed is not just good, as they've been telling us for so long. It is not the best route to achieve the best possible outcomes for the most number of people. It's destabilizing our planet's life support systems. That's a pretty big downside of deregulated capitalism. But also, if this is true, and obviously it is true, then it calls for a forceful government response. You have to regulate, you have to get in the way of fossil fuel companies and tell them, no, you can't dig up, about 80% of the carbon they have already counted in their reserves. You have to invest in the public sphere, something else they don't much like, to get us off fossil fuels and also to protect ourselves from the storms that are already coming. So you see really clearly why they deny climate change, because it profoundly threatens their worldview.